Every murder is horrific in its own way. All of them involve the taking of another human life in ways that are often unbelievably callous and cruel. Today's story, though, is by far and away one of the most haunting and tragic we have discussed on this channel. It is the story of a beautiful young mother who was brutalized and murdered in one of the most ghastly ways imaginable. It is also a story of complete and utter ineptitude on the part of law enforcement, whose incompetence was so striking that many wondered aloud if they were purposefully trying to bungle the case. And lastly, it is the story of a tenacious amateur sleuth who refused to let this senseless tragedy go and ultimately helped bring justice to a family desperately searching for it. This is the story of Jessica Currin. Jessica Currin was just 18 years old in the summer of 2000 and had lived her entire life in the small town of Mayfield, Kentucky. She was the daughter of local fire chief Joe Currin and had been raised in a loving and supportive household. At 17 years old, she became pregnant with a son named Zion, and after a falling out with her child's father, decided to drop out of high school and get a job to make a life for her and her son. In many ways, Jessica was still trying to find herself at this young age, but had taken on her newfound duties as a mother with tenacity and enthusiasm. In July of 2000, she was optimistically marching forward, hoping to create an ideal life for her and Zion, when, without warning, her young life was brutally snuffed out. On the morning of August 1st, 2000, police were called to Mayfield Middle School, where a ghastly discovery had been made by one of the school groundskeepers. The mutilated and badly burnt body of a young African-American woman lay in a field out back of the middle school. Her body had been severely beaten and set on fire, with a plastic bottle that reeked of gasoline lying at her feet. She was later identified as Jessica Currin. She had suffered unimaginable cruelty in the final hours of her life, having been repeatedly sexually assaulted, bludgeoned across her head and body, then strangled with a belt that was found still wrapped around her throat. The small town of Mayfield could hardly believe it when the details were released. The community was no stranger to crime, but that mostly involved drugs and petty theft. Something this horrific was as far from commonplace as it got. Mayfield police officer Tim Fortner, who had literally no experience as a homicide investigator and was even diagnosed by his own boss as, quote, not the brightest bulb in the box, was inexplicably assigned to the case. This would prove a very costly decision, as Officer Fortner was clearly in over his head from the start. He admitted in later interviews that he had no idea how to conduct this sort of investigation, and was terrified from the moment it was assigned to him. Consequently, he would go on to bungle basic steps such as securing the crime scene, as well as collecting and transporting forensic evidence. As news of the terrible discovery circled around Mayfield, a small crowd gathered and watched as police moved in and out of the crime scene. Among the numerous observers was a woman named Susan Galbraith. She had gotten there early and caught a glimpse of Jessica's uncovered body, an image that the small-town homemaker said stuck with her for the rest of her life. She could have hardly known it at the time, but she would end up being an integral part of the investigation to come, and ultimately bringing justice to the poor woman lying in the field before her. Fortner had teams come in and collect as much physical evidence as they could from the scene, only for a significant portion of it to get lost in transit back to the police station. A rape kit was performed on Jessica that determined she had been sexually assaulted by multiple people, only for the kit to be loosely tossed into a bin with several others, where cross-contamination destroyed any evidentiary value that it once held. The most egregious example of investigative incompetence, though, came when a woman named Victoria Caldwell came forward claiming to have information regarding Miss Currin's murder, but said she was afraid to speak with police. Fortner smartly decided to place Miss Caldwell in protective custody, But just days later, before she had even made a statement to Mayfield police, Caldwell disappeared from the officer's home. For reasons that I simply cannot fathom, Officer Fortner's response to losing a witness was a simple shrug of the shoulder, and no attempt was made to locate Victoria until several years later. You might think that Miss Caldwell's cryptic omission would be something Fortner would want to follow up on, but with Jessica's father being the town's well-liked fire chief, there was intense pressure to solve the case as soon as possible. As a result, he quickly settled in on one suspect from basically the beginning of the investigation, and didn't even consider anything outside of that line of reasoning. That suspect was 22-year-old Jeremy Adams, the father of Jessica's son Zion. Jeremy was a small-time criminal with a history of petty theft and other misdemeanors, whose relationship with Miss Currin had broken off the year before, just before she gave birth to their son. Fortner and his team focused on Adams so heavily and so intensely that they gave little thought to the possibility that anyone else may have been involved. The problem was, there was very little evidence, physical or otherwise, linking Mr. Adams to the murder. While he did have a criminal record, there was no history of violence in his background, with most of his crimes involving things like larceny and drug possession. Friends and family of Jessica said that, while the two had gone through a bitter breakup, Adams had made little to no attempt to contact her afterwards, and wasn't much involved in Jessica or Zion's lives. No one had seen Jeremy around Miss Currin during the final days of July 2000, and in fact, all witnesses interviewed by police seemed to state otherwise, saying at the time of the killing, Jeremy was nowhere near Mayfield. Despite this, Officer Fortner continued to focus on Mr. Adams at the cost of ignoring anything else that came across his desk. Even someone so confident they had information on the killing, they wanted police protection in exchange for talking. Despite the lack of evidence, or even a sound theory as to why Adams would brutally murder the mother of his child, Fortner placed him under arrest soon after the murder. For the next 3 years, court proceedings were stalled as Adams' lawyers ripped police's theory, or lack thereof, to shreds, as well as their atrocious handling of the crime scene and physical evidence. Yet, almost like a child blindly determined to fit a square peg in a round hole, Mayfield prosecutors continued to push forward with the indictment. Finally, just 3 days before Adams was scheduled to go on trial, the presiding judge dismissed the charges, saying, quote, "I have never seen a case so encumbered with problems, and I hope I never see another one." With the prosecution of Jeremy Adams falling flat on its face, Jessica Currin's murder seemed poised to fall into the dreaded annals of Mayfield's cold case files, where it would likely have remained unsolved for years. Miss Currin's family, though, would have none of that. Her father and mother staged rallies on an almost monthly basis in front of City Hall, amplifying the pressure on law enforcement and making sure that Currin's case would not get shoved into some file cabinet and forgotten. Her father's position made the pressure on law enforcement very real, as did the outcry from many within Mayfield's African American community, some of which felt that the Mayfield Police Department was purposefully throwing the case because they simply didn't care about the murder of a young black woman as much as they would if she were white. Now, personally, I think this is another situation for good old Hanlon's razor, but it is certainly not a good sign when your investigation is so incompetent, so error-ridden, and so pathetic that a significant portion of your own community believes you are purposefully trying to not solve it. By 2004, a new attorney general had been elected in Kentucky, and Jessica's father had convinced him to take a fresh look at the case. Given the many pitfalls that had befell the original investigation, though, the new probe was coming into things a bit behind the eight ball. By this point, Officer Fortner had left the Mayfield Police Department and moved to nearby Murray, Kentucky, where he became a code enforcement officer, where his job was basically making sure people didn't let their bushes get too high or trash pile up in their yard. And if he's as good at that job as he was being a homicide investigator, it's safe to assume that every yard in Murray looks like the Amazon rainforest by now. In addition to Jessica's family, there was another person in Mayfield determined to make whoever had killed her answer for their crimes. Susan had been haunted by the image of Jessica's body lying in that field, so disfigured that she barely resembled the beautiful and vibrant girl seen in family photos. Then, when news of the flopped investigation reached the citizens of Mayfield, Miss Galbraith made a promise to herself that she would do everything in her power to find the killer. She was about as far from a hardened investigator as it got. She was a homemaker who felt more comfortable gossiping at a hair salon with her friends than working the streets to find a cold-blooded killer. But her gift of gab would prove to be an invaluable asset in her amateur sleuthing days to come. Miss Galbraith began her inquiries by asking all around town about any rumors regarding Jessica's murder, carefully chronicling each and every story she heard, regardless of how outlandish it may have initially seemed. Eventually, her list of hunches grew so large that she realized she needed to call in some help to sift through them and figure out which was the most likely. She rapidly began contacting any and every news outlet she could, from Oprah Winfrey to Dateline NBC, hoping she could find someone who was willing to listen and help start some momentum in the investigation. Eventually, her pleas landed on the ears of veteran BBC journalist Tom Mangold, who found himself intrigued by the tragic story of a young woman's murder on the other side of the globe. He flew to Mayfield, where him and Susan began an unlikely friendship, and started combing through one lead after another, talking to various people around town. One name that came up with almost each and every conversation was Quincy Cross, a drug dealer who lived just across the border in Tennessee. Cross had supposedly been attending a party the night Currin was murdered, where he left abruptly to find girls to pick up and bring back. Many seemed to think that while he was out, he crossed paths with Jessica, leading to her brutal killing. But the circumstances around what happened were still muddy, to say the least. They did, however, find out the morning Jessica's body was found, a Mayfield County sheriff had found a broken-down car with Quincy at the wheel, and the entire vehicle smelling of gasoline. For whatever reason, no one within the sheriff's office decided to share this report with the Mayfield Police Department. Susan and Mangold continued to probe around the small Kentucky town until the latter had to finally return home to the UK, though they would stay in touch and continue to discuss the case even afterwards. By 2006, things had become frustratingly stagnant for all involved. Jessica's father had managed to lobby the Kentucky Bureau of Investigation to take over the case, but they were making little headway, and in fact seemed to be bumping heads against the Mayfield PD, who didn't seem to take very kindly to how thoroughly their work, or lack thereof, was being scrutinized. The circumstantial evidence against Quincy Cross was starting to pile up, with Galbraith even landing an interview with him where she posed as a true crime author who was writing a book on the case. During the interview, she wore a wire, and despite Cross making some incriminating statements, such as asking about the plastic bottle that was found lying next to Jessica at the crime scene, a detail that police hadn't made public, the KBI didn't feel there was quite enough evidence to charge him in the murder. Eventually, Galbraith got the idea to create a MySpace page dedicated to Jessica, hoping that it could not only serve as an online memorial, but possibly generate some leads from people within the community. Her persistence paid off in February 2007, when she received an email from a young woman who claimed to have information about Jessica's murder. That woman was Victoria Caldwell. the same woman who had come forward to police in the early days of the investigation, only to disappear from protective custody, never to be followed up on. She gave Galbraith her number, and the two began speaking on a regular basis, with Victoria initially reluctant to reveal what it was she knew. Eventually, though, after some gentle pressure from Galbraith, she finally came clean and told her horrific tale. In the summer of 2000, Victoria was just 14 years old, and on the night of July 30th had been over her cousin Tamara Caldwell's house. That afternoon, Quincy Cross showed up, who Victoria knew due to the fact that he sold drugs with and to members of her family. At the time he arrived, Victoria had been in a back bedroom with her cousin listening to music. Cross came into the room and began kissing and touching Tamara, who repelled his advances. Victoria said he became agitated, and Tamara pulled away from him once more and remarked, "You can kiss on her," before running out of the room and shutting the door behind her, leaving Victoria alone with Mr. Cross. He then proceeded to sexually assault the young girl and then left the room afterwards. Victoria took a shower, then left the residence briefly before returning there a few hours later. When she arrived back, Quincy and her cousin were still there, along with a man named Jeff Burton, in the same room where Victoria had been assaulted earlier that day. A few minutes later, Tamara came out of the bedroom and told Victoria that Mr. Cross said he was going to kill someone that night. According to Victoria in her later interview with police, Cross said this sort of thing all the time, so initially she didn't pay it any mind. As the hour drew late, Victoria's sister came over to the house and told her it was time to come home, so she left and walked back to her home along with her. Later that night, while she was sitting in her room watching TV, Tamara knocked on the door and asked her if she wanted to go for a ride. She left the house and got into a white vehicle that Quincy was driving, with Jeff Burton in the back seat. The group drove a few blocks away and picked up another young woman named Venetia Stubblefield. Venetia was a friend of Jessica Currin's, and at some point mentioned that they should go pick her up. They drove a few more blocks where they saw Jessica walking down the street, and after a brief conversation with Venetia, she got into the car as well, sitting in the front seat between Tamara and Quincy. At some point during the ride, both Tamara and Quincy began touching Jessica's legs and trying to convince her to have sex with them. Jessica flatly refused, pushing Quincy's hand off of her, which caused him to become visibly angry. The group then drove to Mr. Burton's house, where Cross parked the car and began assaulting Miss Currin with a small club or bat that he had stashed up front with him. After beating her unconscious, the group got out of the car and Burton went up and opened the door, while Tamara and Quincy carried Jessica inside. Quincy, Tamara, and Jeff took Currin into a back bedroom, while Victoria and Venetia stood in the living room. With the bedroom door half open, Victoria saw Cross, her cousin, and Jeff Burton all sexually assault Currin as she laid on the bed, knocked out. Currin regained consciousness and began to struggle, leading to Cross once again striking her with the bat until she was knocked out again. Sometime later, Victoria walked back into the room where she saw Cross strangle Jessica to death with a black belt. After the killing, Cross and Burton carried Jessica's body to a shed out back of the home. The group remained at the house the following day, where Tamara, Cross, and Burton all brainstormed ways to get rid of Miss Currin's body. Eventually, they settled on taking her to the middle school down the road and attempting to cremate her remains to destroy any trace of evidence. Late that night, the group did exactly that, taking Jessica's body to the back of the middle school and setting her on fire. Miss Galbraith could hardly believe what she was hearing. Somehow, this murder had been even more disturbing than she already imagined it to be. She told Miss Caldwell that she needed to go to the police with her story, but Victoria was terrified Cross would retaliate against her if she did. After some convincing, and admitting that she wanted to get the weight off her chest from the traumatic experience of that night, she agreed to go tell the Kentucky Bureau of Investigation everything she knew. Cross and the entire group was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and rape, the lone exception being Victoria, who, in exchange for her testimony, was given a reduced charge of evidence tampering. Facing life in prison, the rest of the group began to flip and make deals with the prosecution. Tamara and Burton agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter and abuse of a corpse in exchange for testimony against Cross, while Venetia Stubblefield pleaded guilty to evidence tampering. Quincy Cross's day in court came in 2008. His defense tried incredibly hard to attack the credibility of Victoria Caldwell, but with all of his accomplices flipping on their client, that task proved much too great. Cross was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tamara, Jeffrey, and Venetia all served small prison terms ranging from a few months to almost 10 years, and as of today are free from what I was able to find. Victoria Caldwell served a few months in prison for evidence tampering and has since moved away from Kentucky and changed her name. Susan Galbraith won Citizen of the Year honors for her work in helping to bring Jessica's killers to justice, but tragically died of natural causes in 2018. After an 8-year roller coaster of police incompetence, tireless work on the part of her family, and an unyielding crusade by a stranger who'd never known her, Jessica Currin's killer was finally in jail, but one can hardly say justice was served, bringing a somber end to this tragic story. This is Crime Spot, and thank you for watching.